Okay, in this last module, we're going to be thinking about social change and globalization a bit more. We've talked a lot about the aspects of society, how it's built, how we study it, but how do we change societies? How do we change some of these forces that are, for some of us, not great? How does social change happen? So in this module, we're going to deal with some of the major issues we've faced today and think about, first off, why does social change not happen? Thinking about something like healthcare, it's an awful system in this country that benefits very few and leaves a lot of people in massive debt. And yet, for some reason, we still have stuck with this system for decades, even though no other country on earth has done that. To understand why things don't change a bit and how they change, we need to think a little bit about a concept we're going to call hegemony. And then in the next video, we'll talk about social movements and social change. So let's focus on one issue for now. Inequality is a huge issue in our society. Most Americans, more than any other country, have experienced cost-related access problems, meaning access to institutions, medicine, or spent, for example, this is an example in healthcare, more than $1,000 out of pocket. This is more than almost any other developed country in the world. At the same time, we have an enormous amount of billionaires in this country, and this is true globally. And we really want to put billionaires in perspective here. If we think about that little flat square in the upper left corner, that's $100,000. That's a lot of money. I would like $100,000, but you would too. When you look at the elevated square, that's $1,000,000. Holy cow. What would I do with $1,000,000? Just think about how much that would change your life if you just had $1,000,000. Now, if we look at the large cube on the right, that's a billion. So what we see here is that the difference between 1,000,000 and 1,000,000,000 is massive. That's just $1 billion. It's a huge difference. It's what we call a geometric difference. And the number of billionaires has only grown over the last 30 years. In fact, it's grown rather exponentially, as has the wealth of those billionaires. So this means that more and more of the wealth in society, think back to that big red square, is concentrated in more and fewer people's hands. Why do we accept this? Right? Why do we say this is okay? Well, to understand why people accept the rule of different ruling classes or dominant groups, we need to understand the concept of hegemony. This comes from an Italian Marxist named Antonio Gramsci. And he spent a lot of time thinking about this because he saw Italy taken over by a fascist regime. And he saw a lot of people out there clamoring for that fascist regime. And it raised this question of, why do people want these people to dominate them and rule over them? So hegemony comes down to two things. It's really about a balance of what we call coercion or force and consent. Certainly, sometimes rule by people over us is through the threat of violence and force. But a lot of the time we see it, as we talked about with authority, as legitimate and right in some way. So how do people gain consent? Because consent is really a much more long-term sustained way of ruling people. It's hard to dominate people and to force them to obey you for a long time. And the end result, of course, being that you just kill and imprison a lot of people, which isn't a very productive kind of society. And what the ruling group has to do in a situation is try to convince people that the status quo, the way things are, is not only good for the ruling group, but also good for everyone. It's good for us and for them. Right? So this is done primarily through two mechanisms, and it's key to remember these two things: ideology and what we might call concessions. On the ideology side, they have to convince us that the way the world is probably the best way for everyone. In our country, for example, we're told that having billionaires is good because then those billionaires will spend money on us, everyday people, hire jobs, start companies, and that's the best of all outcomes. If we try to redistribute their wealth and put it through government, then we'd have a lot of lazy people and inefficient systems. So a key part of this ideology is convincing us that Everyone is basically kind of a self-serving, lazy individual, and without a competitive market, that we would all be worse off. So we're told it's better for those billionaires to have their wealth and for us to be thrown into competition for jobs and stuff on a daily basis. But they also have to make some concessions. And what those concessions are is typically things like the right to vote, some idea that we have some sort of control and that our lives aren't completely miserable. So this often means, like, for example, we see occasional female entrepreneurs get into positions of power, even though women are largely excluded from power. This convinces people that women, if they work hard, can make it to the top, even though we know from our class that there's systematic barriers in their place. We've seen concessions change over time. The right to vote, minimum wages, all of those sorts of systems were concessions given by the dominant group in society to sort of appease the people who were not in power. And today we tend to see this hegemony actually kind of fracturing and breaking up as the inequalities of our society and the extraordinary fragility that all of us are in is kind of laid bare by the current coronavirus crisis. So this then begs the question of what happens next and how do we try to change things for the better? And we'll talk about that in the next video.